Morning, everyone. We are going to finish chapter 2 today, and we're going to pick it up from when Basil calls Henry and Dorian back into the studio. This, of course, is where Dorian sees his painting completed and he reacts to it. So you need to have your tables handy. There's going to be quite a lot of information from today's lesson that you're going to need to put onto your tables with respect to the painting. You will also see that I have underlined certain quotes as we progress through the lesson. Those quotes reflect descriptions of the painting itself. The painting from this moment on begins to feature quite significantly in the novel. So from this point onwards, you need to have your table handy and you need to look at what happens to the painting. It is in this lesson that we will see the Gothic element begin to be introduced into the novel. So please be aware of that as well. All right, so of course yesterday ended with this impact that Henry had had on Dorian about the brevity of youth and beauty, that very important quote that we referred to yesterday, nothing can cure the soul but the senses, just as nothing can cure the senses but the soul. And it is on the back of this that Basil calls Henry and Dorian back into the studio. And of course, Basil is completely unaware of what has transpired between Henry and Dorian. So it's really, really important that you look at each of the characters in the context in which they find themselves, one being completely unaware and not understanding Dorian's responses, and then, of course, Henry and Dorian themselves. So firstly, have a look at Henry himself as they get called back in. So we're about 2/3 of the way down page 31. He says to Dorian, he says, "You are glad you have met me, Mr. Grey," said Lord Henry, looking at him. And there's almost this reinforcement, if you like, of what they had discussed in the garden. And Henry is just reasserting himself because now he knows that he's going back in to where Basil is and the warning that Basil gave him about not spoiling Dorian. Quite an interesting concept to bear in mind from this point on in the novel is the role that Henry and Basil each play in Dorian's life. I'm sure many of you have seen the cartoons where you've got the devil and the angel on the shoulders of a person, each one whispering in. So you've got the devil on one side, the angel on the other, each one whispering into someone's ear, trying to persuade them to their way of thinking. One almost has that sense with Henry and Basil, that Henry is like the devil on the shoulder and Basil is like the angel on the shoulder, each one trying to pull Dorian to their way of thinking. So just have that picture in mind and you'll see it start to unfold, particularly at the end of this chapter. So Henry says, "You are glad you have met me, Mr. Grey." And Dorian responds, "Yes, I am glad now. I wonder, shall I always be glad?" Little bit of foreshadowing there. There are moments in the novel, and we'll obviously explore them when we get there, but there are moments in the novel where very briefly Dorian does some self-introspection and he regrets momentarily, but there are those moments. And of course Henry's very flippant response to him in the next paragraph, and we're just going to pick up the last sentence. He berates him for using the word always, and he says, "The only difference between a caprice and a lifelong passion is that the caprice lasts a little longer." Now, the word caprice means a sudden or inexplicable change in mood or behavior. If you like, when you talk about someone who acts on a whim or a fancy, that they just sort of are very impulsive in the way that they do things. And once again, we see the character of Henry here, that he is not concerned with emotional connection. And he makes this as another epigram, but he has the suggestion, that the life of impulse, the life that is unpredictable, the person whose behavior is unpredictable, is the person that he prefers. And he says that is more lasting than the person who is dedicated to a single passion. And then, of course, they go into the studio, and Dorian responds. He says, well, then let our friendship be a caprice. And now they go in and they see the painting in its completed form. And it's important now that you look at each of the characters' responses to the painting. So on your table, you're going to put Basil's response, Henry's response, Dorian's response. And you will see they're quite long. You're going to have a couple of quotes potentially for some of the characters. So I would suggest you start off doing it in pencil, and then you can neaten it up as you go along. There's this beautiful atmosphere again created at the top of page 32 of Basil finishing off, stepping back and admiring his work and knowing that he has done really good work. And we're going to pick it up in the second paragraph, where Dorian goes in and Basil says to him just before the end of the paragraph, "It is quite finished," he cried at last, and stooping down, he wrote his name in long vermilion letters on the left-hand corner of the canvas, the mark of the artist. He is proud of the work that he has done, and now it is finished. In the next paragraph, we get Henry's response. So he comes and looks at the painting first, and it is described, "It was certainly a wonderful work of art and a wonderful likeness as well." Now, those of you who do art will know how hard it is to recreate the face of a person. The human figure is particularly difficult to paint. So this is a huge compliment that Basil's work is good and that it is a fine work of art. And he says to to Basil in the next paragraph, "It is the finest portrait of modern times." That's an enormous compliment to make to him. And then, of course, he calls Dorian over to have a look at it. And we're going to pick it up now on page 32 in the last paragraph. Dorian initially is it would seem, relatively disinterested in seeing how the painting turns out. And then he begins to absorb it. Now you've got to look at his reaction in the context of what Henry has said to him in the garden. We pick it up about 3 lines into the paragraph. "When he saw it, he drew back, and his cheeks flushed for a moment with pleasure. A look of joy came into his eyes, as if he had recognized himself for the first time." So remember what we discussed yesterday, how it is that Henry triggers something within Dorian, something that's been potentially repressed or something that he has not really ever been aware of about himself. Henry triggers it. And so we have this reaction. He sees himself as if he's seeing himself for the first time. A couple of lines down, and this is an important quote. This is one of the quotes that you may want to put on your table. "The sense of his own beauty came on him like a revelation. He had never felt it before. And it goes on to say how while Basil had complimented him over the weeks or months that they've known one another, he dismissed Basil's compliments. But after what Henry has said to him in the garden, he sees himself almost with new eyes. And it triggers this really extreme reaction. Basil, of course, can't understand the reaction because he doesn't know the conversation that has happened in the garden. But we pick it up the top of page 33, 3 lines down. Yes, there would be a day when his face would be wrinkled and wizen, his eyes dim and colourless, the grace of his figure broken and deformed. The scarlet would pass away from his lips and the gold steal from his hair. The life that was to make his soul would mar his body. He would become dreadful, hideous, and uncouth. Think about the conversation between him and Henry. Can you see how his thoughts now mimic Henry's conversation? He starts to think like Henry. That's really, really important. Remember that we've been tracking his transition from the beginning of the chapter to the end. Can you see how that transition has taken place? He starts off, we see the petulant boy. There's a naivety about him. Then there's this awakening that begins in the garden. And look at how he changes. He becomes like Henry as he thinks about his own beauty. The next paragraph, end of the paragraph, he felt as if a hand of ice had been laid upon his heart. Basil is confused by this reaction. He doesn't know what it is, why it is that Dorian's just standing there aghast in front of the painting, and he thinks that he doesn't like it because his reaction is so uncalled for. And Henry responds, well, of course he likes it. And Henry then wants to buy the painting from Basil. He offers, he said, I'll give you anything you ask. And Basil says, well, it's not mine. It's not mine to give you. It's Dorian. Dorian is fixated on himself as he looks at his reflection in the painting. He's fixated on this idea that beauty and youth are fleeting. And so he continues. He's not interested in owning it. He's not interested in the conversation that's happening between Basil and Henry. He's fixated on what the painting represents. And so we pick it up, page 33, second last paragraph. How sad it is, murmured Dorian Gray with his eyes still fixed upon his own portrait. How sad it is. I shall grow old and horrible and dreadful. But this picture will remain always young. It will never be older than this particular day of June. If it were only the other way, if it were I who was to be always young, and the picture that was to grow old. For that I would give everything. Yes, there is nothing in the whole world I would not give. I would give my soul for that. Now, this is where the Dr. Faust legend comes in. So that is the document that I sent to you on Sunday night. You will see in that document that I gave you an explanation for the Faust legend. And of course, in the Faust legend itself, the Faustus, Dr. Faustus himself, he sells his soul to the devil. And in return, the devil gives him these experiences and wealth and wisdom and knowledge and so forth, and he sells his soul. Now, Dorian at this moment does not consciously sell his soul to the devil, but he's willing to. He is willing to give up his soul to remain young and beautiful, and for the painting to take on his aging and the loss of his beauty. Now, of course, we know that it is at this point that the Gothic element of the supernatural comes in, because we know that the painting does just as he wishes. This wish, this offer of his soul for the painting to take on his aging, is what begins this idea of the supernatural. And the painting, if you like, takes on a life of its own. And we watch that unfold as the novel develops. So this is that moment. As he makes this wish, at this moment is when that painting is imbued with its own soul and its own spirit. And so we will look at the development of that as the novel continues. Henry and Basil are still worried about the art form itself. They're not really listening very carefully to what Dorian says. And then Dorian turns on Basil. At the top of page 34, Dorian Gray turned and looked at him. "I believe you would, Basil. You like your art better than your friends. I'm no more to you than a green bronze figure. Hardly as much, I dare say." Can you see, remember Basil made this observation about Dorian, that there are times when he can be very cruel, and we see this as one of those moments. And Basil's reaction, of course, he stares in amazement. It was so unlike Dorian to speak like that. What had happened? He seemed quite angry. His face was flushed and his cheeks burning. And Dorian continues this tirade at Basil and accuses him of not caring about him and his just being an art form to him. And then at the end of the next paragraph he says, "I know now that when one loses one's good looks, whatever they may be, one loses everything. Your picture has taught me that." Now, what is important about that statement, "your picture has taught me that"? Of course, for those of you who have read further in the novel, you will know there's a moment of foreshadowing again. It gets picked up in chapter 12. So the connection between these early chapters and chapter 12 is really, really important. But it's the beginning of our observing Dorian's refusal ever to take responsibility for his actions. And he always wants to blame someone else for what he chooses. And this is the first moment we see that. He's saying, well, it's your painting that's brought along upon me this despair that I'm so overwhelmed and so distraught. It's your painting that's done that to me. The first accusation that he levels at Basil. And he carries on. "Lord Henry Wotton is perfectly right. Youth is the only thing worth having. When I find it that I'm growing old, I shall kill myself." Now, of course, there's foreshadowing there. For those of you who have read the novel, you will know this. You will understand the link and the foreshadowing there. But again, can you see the influence that Henry has had on him? That he absorbs what Henry has said to him in the garden, and his whole life begins to revolve around the concept that youth and beauty are the only things worth having. And Basil is distraught. He's really, really hurt by what Dorian has said. Remember, we have had insight into Basil's feelings for Dorian and how much Dorian means to him as a person. And he's horrified that Dorian would think that he is no more to him than an object of art. And so in the next paragraph, Hallward turned pale and caught his hand. Dorian, Dorian, he cried, don't talk like that. I have never had such a friend as you, and I shall never have such another. You are not jealous of material things, are you? You who are finer than any of them? And Dorian's response, I am jealous of everything whose beauty does not die. I am jealous of the portrait you have painted of me. Why would it keep what I must lose? And he makes the wish again, a couple of lines down. If the picture could change, and I could be always what I am now, why did you paint it? It will mock me someday, mock me horribly. And again, there's the foreshadowing. So we see some of it in chapter 11. We see it in chapter 12, and of course we see it at the end of the novel. So this idea of the picture mocking him, and of the picture having the ability to mock him. There's the Gothic element coming in again. Basil suddenly realizes where this is coming from. He makes the connection. He doesn't know what is said in the garden, but he certainly knows where Dorian's reaction has been triggered. And he turns on Henry and he says to him, this is your doing, Harry, said the painting bitterly. And Henry's response is very interesting. He says, it is the real Dorian Gray. That is all. The trigger. He's unpacked something within Dorian that Dorian perhaps wasn't aware of. Basil saw signs of it, but overlooked it, forgave it. And Henry's saying, well, this is just the real person. What you've seen up until now, that's not the real one. And Henry Basil rather, he's fuming at Henry. He had asked him not to spoil Dorian. He had asked him to be kind. He had asked him to respect him. He had asked him to go away because he knew of his danger. And Henry just dismisses it. He said, well, you eventually did ask me to stay. Don't blame me. And Basil's response is important. Top of page 35. He says, Harry, I can't quarrel with my two best friends at once. But between you both, you have made me hate the finest piece of work I have ever done. And I will destroy it. Now, it's important, of course, we see something of Basil's character, his sensitivity as an artist, as a person, his desire for emotional connection with people. He is not superficial. There's a depth to him. He does connect with others. But the other important point of this reaction of Basil's is the power that the painting has to divide. The idea that the painting has come between him and his friends. And what is important about it, of course, is that he then threatens to destroy it. And we have that rather dramatic moment. If you were watching this as a film, it would be one of these really heightened moments in the film where he goes about looking for a knife with which to slash the painting and to rip it to pieces. And again, we see the power of the painting in Dorian's response. And we pick it up about a third of the way down page 35. Basil's about to rip the canvas. He's about to destroy his painting. Dorian, with a stifled sob, the lad leapt from the couch and, rushing over to Hallward, tore the knife out of his hand and flung it to the end of the studio. And here's the quote that's really important. Don't, Basil, don't, he cried. It would be murder. Foreshadowing again, for those of you who have read, it's really, really important. But the idea again of the painting being imbued with a soul of its own, with its own spirit that reflects Dorian Gray. And in a sense, he's saying, if you had to destroy the painting, you are destroying me. You would be murdering me. And Basil responds, I'm glad you appreciate my work at last, Dorian, said the painter coldly when he had recovered from his surprise. I never thought you would. Appreciate it? I'm in love with it, Basil. It is part of myself. I feel that. This connection between Dorian and the painting. So if when you are updating your tables, you need to have a look. These are the impacts of the painting. You need to unpack this carefully after we finished with our lesson today and choose your quotes quite carefully. Henry watches on with amusement at the scene that unfolds before him. And in typical fashion, he says, we're picking it up at the bottom of the last paragraph of page 35, he says, I adore simple pleasures, said Lord Henry. They are the last refuge of the complex. But I don't like scenes, except on the stage. What absurd fellows you are, both of you. I wonder who it was defined man as a rational animal. It was the most premature definition ever given. Man is many things, but he is not rational. Another epigram speaks for itself. We don't need to unpack that one in a lot of detail, but it speaks for itself. But again, can you see Henry, he doesn't want to become emotionally involved in all this drama between Basil and Dorian. He doesn't connect. He's not interested. It's not entertaining to him. He said, I don't like these scenes, really stop being irrational. And he carries on. It is at this point, of course, that Dorian decides he does want the painting. And Basil says he's quite happy. He'll have it framed and varnished. So, of course, in those times, there wasn't lacquer and the nice fancy technological stuff we have to preserve paintings. Now it would literally be varnished, painted over with varnish to protect the canvas. And he will then gift it to Dorian. And then they decide that this drama's over, they're going to have tea together, and it all seems to be a done deal. And then they have this debate about going to the theatre. And once again, we see Henry's selfishness. He says, let's go to the theatre, let's go and do something nice. And he carries on. We are about halfway down page 36. He says, there is sure to be something on somewhere. I have promised to dine at White's, but it is only with an old friend, so I can send him a wire to say that I'm ill. Can you see how Henry operates? Henry is essentially self-centered, selfish. He is not concerned with other people's emotions, whether he hurts them or offends them or doesn't hurt them or offend them. He really couldn't care. If something more interesting comes up, he goes to it. We've already seen earlier in this chapter that he's already missed another appointment, another engagement that he had committed to because he finds Dorian more entertaining. And so we see this again. A little bit, Basil, of course, doesn't want to go to the theatre, doesn't like dressing up, is not interested in all this image. And Henry says, a little bit further down, he says, yes, answered Lord Henry dreamily, the costume of the 19th century is detestable. It's so sombre, so depressing. Sin is the only real colour element left in modern life. There's Henry again. There's the hedonist. And it is the hedonist that he is developing in Dorian Gray. Basil counters him. He says, you shouldn't be saying things like that in front of Dorian, because remember, Basil hasn't seen this awakening in Dorian. He hasn't seen what's triggered. He's seen the consequence of it. He doesn't know what it is that Henry has said to Dorian. And he says to him, and this is really, really important, he says to him, before which Dorian, it's right at the bottom of page 36, the one who is pouring out tea for us, or the one in the picture? Because they're separate people now. The one in the picture is the naive lad that Basil painted. He captured those moments, that expression on his face. The one who's pouring the tea is the one who's been triggered, who's been awakened. And Basil knows it. And he teases Henry knows it. And he teases Basil because he knows Basil doesn't know what's been discussed between them. Eventually, Dorian and Henry agree to go to the theatre, and Basil says he's not going. He says, I shall stay with the real Dorian. He's going to stay with the portrait. Because that's the Dorian he knows. He doesn't know this Dorian who's been ranting and raving in front of him over the painting and making wishes over it and bemoaning the fact that his beauty is going to pass. But the Basil that he has captured for eternity, he thinks, in his painting, is the Dorian he knows and the Dorian he trusts. And so he says, I shall stay with the real Dorian. And that's about 6 lines down on page 37. And so, of course, as we draw to a close, we see the closing shot, if you like, between Basil and Dorian and Henry. And we're picking it up now towards the bottom of page 37. Basil tries to persuade Dorian not to go. And Dorian says, I have promised Lord Henry Wotton to go with him. And Basil's response, he says he won't like you the better for keeping your promises. He always breaks his own. There's Basil's knowledge and understanding of Henry. As much as he has him as a friend, and they are very good friends, he knows Henry for what he is. He knows it is Henry who has changed Dorian. He knows Henry is not interested in emotional connection. He knows Henry does not keep his promises. And he says to Dorian, why on earth are you worried about what you've promised him? He'll drop you like that if he finds something else more entertaining to do. But of course, Dorian has been taken in by Henry. Henry's triggered something within him. And so Henry has become, if you like, his new flavor of the month. There's the angel and the devil sitting on Dorian's shoulder. And right now, he's going with the devil. And as they leave, Basil says to Henry, and we're on the last page of the chapter, page 38, about halfway down. He says to Henry, remember what I asked you when we were in the garden this morning? And Henry says, I've forgotten it. So, of course, remember that Basil has said to Henry, please don't spoil him. And we know, of course, that Henry's long forgotten that, and that he has, in fact, spoiled Dorian. And ironically, Basil says to Henry, I trust you. And Henry says, I wish I could trust myself, said Lord Henry, laughing. Come, Mr. Grey, and off they go. And the chapter ends now with Basil's response. As the door closed behind them, the painter flung himself down on a sofa, and a look of pain came into his face. He knows. He knows he's lost Dorian to Henry. He knows that Henry has already spoiled Dorian, and that there's no coming back from it. All right, so that's the end of chapter 2. You need to just go back through your notes. You need to check that you've captured the transition in Dorian and that you've updated your table in terms of the different reactions to the painting. And then we'll pick up chapter 3. Chapter 3 is really just one of those chapters that it sort of gets us up to date in terms of the plot, so we'll probably cover it in 1, maybe 2 lessons, and then we'll move on to chapter 4 next week. Have a good day. Bye.